our webinar, Remote Work is a Reasonable Accommodation, No Blankets Allowed. My name is Anne Deschamps. I am the director of the Mid-Atlantic Region ADA Center, and I am joined by my colleague and partner in crime, Associate Director Nancy Horton. Nancy, you want to say hi?
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you all for joining us today.
We have people from all over the country today. I think we hit a hot topic, Nancy. As you said, we're talking about remote work as a reasonable accommodation. And before we launch right into the topic at hand, let's revisit the definition of reasonable accommodation, and we will go to slide number 13. So what is a reasonable accommodation? It is an individualized, and notice the italics of individualized. You will hear that a lot today. Modification, adjustment, allowance, or provision that facilitates an equal employment opportunity for a worker with a disability. And this is in applying for a job, in performing the essential job functions, or in accessing the benefits and privileges of the job. I want to remind everybody that 33 years ago, when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, one of the things that we talked about more than anything else was reasonable accommodation as a way of leveling the playing field to provide equal opportunity to participate for people with disabilities. So this is the intention of the ADA, is to level the playing field. And one of the ways they do that is through reasonable accommodation. Nancy, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk specifically and dive into this whole remote work situation.
Thanks, Anne. Let's move on to our next slide, number 14. We just wanted to, again, we want to stress that reasonable accommodation is an individualized thing. It is something unique. And so since we're talking about remote work today, we thought we would just have a couple of examples to illustrate this distinction between equal treatment, everybody gets the same things, everybody gets to do the same things, and an equal opportunity that's facilitated through the provision of reasonable accommodation. So in our little box on the left here, we have this example of an employer policy that says all employees in a certain job category or certain job categories may work from home 2 days a week. Nobody can work from home more frequently, regardless of whether they can do their job remotely or not. That's the policy. On the right, we have some examples of reasonable accommodation. So employees that have disability-related needs may be able to work from home 3 or 4 days a week, or maybe full-time, or maybe on an as-needed basis. And so this is just an example of this distinction that's so important when it comes to reasonable accommodation. If an employer has a policy like the one on the left, then workers with disabilities are going to be able to work those 2 days from home just like everyone else. That's non-discrimination. That's basic. But that's not reasonable accommodation, because reasonable accommodation by definition is something different, something unique from what everybody else already gets to do. So if an employee with a disability needs to work from home more than 2 days a week, or maybe different days of the week, or something like that, that's where the reasonable accommodation process may need to get started. So there's nothing wrong with a general policy like the one on the left, and an employer can have that policy and keep that policy in place in general. But employers may need to consider individualized adjustments to that policy or other policies in order to accommodate individual workers with disabilities. So that's that's an example of how reasonable accommodation could be different and a unique thing. So with that, I want to kick it back to Anne for a moment to talk about, to bring us back to our concept about blankets today.
Thank you, Nancy. Slide 15, please. So you might be wondering why we called the webinar No Blankets Allowed, because we're finding in the calls and questions we're getting, a lot of employers are instituting blanket policies on remote work, saying everybody has to come back to the workplace regardless, and or you know, and applying it and saying, yeah, you know, everybody, and that includes all people with disabilities. And as Nancy reminded us, reasonable accommodation is something that is unique. And we've known for 33 years that, again, employers can have whatever policies they have, that they apply to everybody, right? As long as then they're, when you're looking at cases of reasonable accommodation, it is a separate case-by-case determination. Case by case, remember? And that's something we're finding that people are forgetting. Reasonable accommodation is a case-by-case determination. So it's individualized based on two things, right? The job, including all those aspects of the job, the application, the essential functions, the benefits and privileges. And then obviously the disability, because that's what you're looking at when you're considering what works, what would be effective for a reasonable accommodation, the specific limitation and needs of the individual or applicant with a disability, and the job and what is needed for the job. So those are the two things that you consider. And it's an individualized approach, which is why you cannot use blankets and why there are no blankets allowed. All right. Apparently, I'm a little more entertained by the title than most people are. So, okay, next slide, please. Nancy, back to you to remind everybody what the interactive process looks like.
Yes, the reasonable accommodation starts with the interactive process. Typically, it starts with a request that comes from an applicant or employee. And, you know, in some cases, these things are so simple that we don't need much of an interactive process, but very often we really need that interactive process to make things, you know, to really work things out and make sure that we're successful in the long run, as successful as we can be. So this is just an example of sort of the process, the responsibilities and the roles, the steps that need to be taken by both the applicant or employee, the individual, and the employer. So this is a typical kind of process for any type of accommodation, not just remote work, but any type of accommodation. An individual with a disability might request something specific, or they might just let their employer know that they're having difficulty with something. Maybe the individual has a newly developed disability, or their condition has changed, or something about the job or the workplace has changed. And so this process needs to start. But the process is essentially one of communication and collaboration. So again, typically we start with a request from an individual. The employer reviews that request. If the individual's disability and or need for accommodation are not already known by the employer or obvious to the employer might request medical documentation. The individual has a responsibility to provide that medical documentation. If needed, the employer will review that and determine if the individual meets the ADA's definition of disability. And then they'll talk about the practical issues. The individual, again, may request something specific, may offer ideas or options. They'll talk about those things. They may do some research. They may get some consultation. The employer ultimately will decide what they're going to provide or what they're going to try first. Maybe then the parties will take steps to implement that accommodation or those accommodations. And then we often suggest that employers monitor accommodations once they've been implemented, depending on the nature of the accommodation. Might want to check in with the individual in a couple of weeks or a couple of months to see how things are going. And if either party finds that something is not working well or something else is needed, then they should reach out, touch base and keep the lines of communication going. So this is just kind of a typical outline of that process. That's where the communication is so important. And on our next slide.
And Nancy, can I hop into just here for a minute? I think it's important to underline and highlight. This is an ongoing obligation. It doesn't stop once you check off the box saying reasonable accommodation provided. That monitoring and revisit, if necessary, the last two bullets, it's an ongoing obligation. And so you keep having to check in on that. And that's just something to highlight here.
Exactly. And I think it's the same for workers.
Yeah.
If it's not working out, you need to let the employer know, because sometimes they aren't going to know unless you let them know. So that,
right.
Communication's a two-way street, right?
Right. And just because you've asked for it once, that doesn't mean that's up, your gig's up, and if it's not working, oh, tough, that's no, it's not working. So we have to revisit it again, and you're back to the interactive process and that drawing board of going back and forth until you figure out what works. And just like if it's not working for the employer says, oh, I've already agreed to it, too late. No, not too late. If it's not working for you, it's revisit it. So,
and things can change over time.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Yeah. But so moving on to slide 17, we want to, bring back the focus here to telework, working remotely. And in considering that, again, employers may need to modify policies. They may need to allow workers with disabilities to work remotely more frequently or in different ways or something than other workers. And they might need to allow that even if no other workers are allowed to work remotely at all, ever. That's reasonable accommodation, something unique. So employers need to focus on these fundamental questions. Does the individual have a disability as defined under the ADA? Does the individual need to telework because of disability? And can the individual perform the essential functions of their job remotely? And there are a lot of factors that can go into this analysis, depending on the nature of the job. For example, are there any kind of technology issues or security issues that might prevent or limit telework? Are there any equipment issues? Is there a piece of equipment that the worker has to use and it's only in the workplace and it can't be at home or in another location? Does the job require interactions with supervisors, co-workers, or the public that cannot be accomplished remotely? We have a lot of options these days, a lot of technologies that can enable us to communicate and interact very effectively remotely, but there still are some things and some functions of some jobs that need to be done in person. We were chatting the other day about a job where a social worker has to make home visits to investigate allegations of neglect or abuse And that's something that's a little hard to duplicate in a virtual environment. That might be an example of a job duty that somebody really is going to have to do that in person. They're going to have to go and visit the home or the nursing home or a location and interact with people on a face-to-face basis. But we certainly have a lot of jobs that can be accomplished remotely, or that parts of jobs can be accomplished remotely. Another factor to think about is how the employer can supervise the employee, how the employer can keep track of the work that's being accomplished. Are there deadlines to be met? Is the accomplishment of tasks then connected to the ability of other workers to accomplish tasks? Supervision, again, can be accomplished remotely. A lot of employers and workers have learned a lot more about remote work in recent years, and we've come a long way. So it really can be successful, but it needs to be analyzed, as Ann said, in a case-by-case way when it comes to reasonable accommodation. So some employees with disabilities might only need to work at home occasionally, or on a part-time basis, or on an as-needed basis that enables them to manage their disability needs, and a few might need to work from home all the time. And again, for some jobs, that's possible. Working from home is another example of an accommodation that I think can sometimes benefit from a trial period, especially if it's something that you haven't done before, or the worker hasn't worked in that way before, or maybe the employer doesn't have experience with it. So maybe there's a little bit of concern about how it's going to work out. And other accommodations can be like this too. Sometimes it's not a bad idea to try something, and then the parties aren't just speculating or guessing about how it's going to work or if it's going to work. You could do a trial period for something, and that might be a useful way to really see how it can work, or maybe iron out the bugs of that. So this is an issue that we again we get a lot of calls about remote work requests for people with disabilities working from home, and these are some of the things that need to be analyzed. And it's really helpful if we keep in mind that decisions need to not be made based on speculation and assumptions and things like that under the ADA.
Nancy, we have a great question that comes at this time because I think it's the perfect time to discuss this. And this is a common one that we have seen quite a bit. If an employee asserts that they can come into the workspace sometimes, unpredictably, and with no limits on the number of hours per day, days per week, but also states that they cannot follow a policy of 2 days per week, like in your example, how can we work with the employee and their healthcare provider to better understand how this could be possible?
I'm not really sure that I'm exactly following the question, but I guess maybe the question is about understanding what their disability related need is,
right,
which may be related to the unpredictable factor. And again, if these things aren't known or obvious, there seems to be lack of clarity or confusion around either of these factors, whether the person has a disability, what their limitations are, what their needs are, what the connection between their disability is and the accommodation they're asking for, the need to work remotely, and on an unpredictable basis. Why is that? Sometimes employers can get that information, can get that kind of explanation from the individual. Healthcare providers can give medical information, but sometimes you just need that sort of common sense connection as to, how their disability sort of functions in relation to that unpredictability factor. There are a lot of disabilities that themselves are kind of unpredictable. Things that, MS and arthritis that have flares and things of that nature, ups and downs, sleep disorders, all kinds of conditions that can themselves be unpredictable, and that can sometimes be a factor. And once you understand that, I think that can help employers. It is important to understand the needs. And once you've established disability and need, then the focus sort of shifts to the practical issues of, like in this example, is the unpredictability going to be a problem in relation to the job? Or is it not? Is it, does it really matter if the person gets their work done at certain hours of the day, or is it good enough if they just get things done by the end of the week? Or, it's so case by case that it's a little hard to answer questions in the abstract, but unpredictability can certainly be a factor in the analysis of a lot of types of accommodation, because some jobs need to have at least some level of predictability or, reliable performance. Most jobs have a little bit of flexibility built in, because that's reality. We're human beings. Everybody's going to get sick and have car trouble and family issues. And so there's little room for that already. But at the same time, many jobs have a tipping point.
Yeah.
Where you need some reliability.
Well, and I think I'm guessing that's what this person was getting at. Like, okay, you can't come in 2 days a week when you're not sure when you can, but you can come in sometime. What we have to be able to know when you're going to be working or not. But I think you're right, slowing down and looking at the job and what does the job require, and is the person actually able to perform their essential functions at home, and where is that coming in? I think sometimes I see situations where we let we rush to judgment, and depending on how much information we don't have, instead of collecting all the information we need to make a good decision.
Yeah. And then again, sometimes we need to try it.
Right. And that's why,
yeah.
EEOC loves that trial period. They highly recommend trial periods for reasonable accommodation.
If somebody's job performance, deteriorates, whether they have a disability or not, that's something employers need to address, right? But, the idea of accommodation is it enables performance. So if it's not working for that, it's time to revisit.
Right. Absolutely. Okay, slide 18. So and this is taken right from the interpretive guidance on regulations to implement the equal employment provisions of the ADA. If 2 accommodations would be effective, or I would say more than 2 accommodations would be effective, an employer may provide the one that is less costly or easier to provide. But, the preference of the individual with a disability should be given primary consideration. So primary consideration, see, that's where we're getting at, again, the interactive process between the person with a disability and the employer. I just want to clarify a question that we had earlier, Deborah. The employer determines during that interactive process whether the individual has a disability under the ADA and that they're in ADA land and providing reasonable accommodations. That's part of the process. Are we talking about reasonable accommodation now, or are we not talking about reasonable accommodation? There was a question about Does the employer determine disability, or how does that work? So that's where that comes in. But primary consideration should be given to the individual with a disability. And again, it has to go back and forth. So if the accommodation doesn't work for the individual with a disability, it's not an effective accommodation. And as if it doesn't work for the employer, it's not an effective accommodation. So there's experimentation and trial periods, which are very much encouraged. Okay, slide 19. As I just said, accommodations must be effective. Employers may provide alternative accommodations, but they must be effective in ensuring equal opportunities. So enable the individual to apply for the job, what we said before, achieve performance level comparable to others, etc. So you really have to look at effectiveness of this. And Nancy and I were talking yesterday that we often see employers and people with disabilities go too quickly here. The reasonable accommodation process can take a little while with some trial and error before determining what is most effective. And again, primary consideration should be given to the individual with a disability, but just because an individual is requesting remote work doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only option that is available or that would be the most effective. You want to go through that process of evaluation and what works and what doesn't work. And if a person is requesting remote work, why are they requesting remote work, as Nancy said earlier? Okay, you want to talk about limitations, Nancy?
Yes, on our next slide, number 20, just want to remind folks that the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation is not unlimited. It's limited by undue hardship, which means that the employer would encounter significant difficulty or expense, or both. And employers do not have to allow direct threat, which means a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual, the worker, or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. And we always like to remind people that, here again, we see the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation to reduce or eliminate direct threat, should that arise. It's pretty rare, but there can be sometimes concern that the individual, the worker, is going to be harmed or they're going to cause some harm. But is there an accommodation that can address that? So again, the broad concept of accommodation is not just a one thing kind of thing. And I think on our next slide, on slide 21, we like to, again, remind folks that an accommodation doesn't have to stand alone. Accommodation doesn't necessarily have to be just one thing or a one and done, this or that kind of approach. Remote work or any other kind of accommodation might need to be combined with other accommodations to really achieve effective outcomes. Some examples, these are just a few examples: adjusted or flexible schedules. Somebody maybe comes in later than typical and then stays later, or maybe they have some flexibility because they have maybe an unpredictable kind of disability. So there's some flexibility. Sometimes maybe there's some parameters around that, but there's some flexibility. Workplace accommodations, providing equipment, making accessibility improvements in facilities, adjusting communication or supervisory methods, granting time off. sometimes it takes more than one. It takes a combination to really achieve effective outcomes. And again, like Anne mentioned, that, we're looking for what's effective for both parties here, and really listening to the individual with the disability to make sure that, especially in the case of alternative accommodations, that they're not accommodations that simply enable the person to struggle and take twice as much time to accomplish their work as other people, which reduces their opportunities for bonuses or promotions or things of that nature, are not going to be as effective. And accommodations, like I always like to remind folks, I have an example here of an accommodation of giving time off. And sometimes workers with disabilities need time off related to their disabilities, and it can be an effective accommodation in enabling them to return to work and perform essential functions. But accommodations that facilitate work are always preferred to accommodation to giving people time off. So if you can do accommodations that enable people to work, that's a win-win for workers and employers. Working's better than not working. So sometimes time off is appropriate, but people shouldn't be just, employees shouldn't be just put off work for lack of an accommodation that might enable them to work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Nancy, I think sometimes it might be a case where a person with a disability is requesting accommodation and they've really thought it through carefully, and they, it's a high stakes situation, and they go and request from the employer, and when the employer might balk or say we want to pursue some different things, it might be a little off-putting, especially when they put a lot of time and consideration into what they're requesting. And I understand that, which is why I think encouraging multiple options and combinations of things, and I think everybody, employers and people with disabilities, need to keep an open mind and get creative and kind of think outside the box, to use an overused phrase. Because again, this is, as you said, this is something unique. And so if you look at that unique, this is an individual with a disability. I don't care if it's the same disability as somebody you accommodated last week. It doesn't affect the person the same way necessarily. It's a different accommodation. So everything has to be considered unique.
Yeah.
Uniquely.
Absolutely. And again, I think that, employers aren't the only parties in this process that might need to consider trying something. Yeah. Workers might need to consider trying something that they didn't consider in the first place too. If an employer says, well, how about this? And the worker's just really, really sure that's not going to work for them, they should be able to explain that as to why they feel it's not going to. I tried something like exactly that before in another job or something, and here's why. And, again, if they're really talking to each other and listening to each other, then, they're going to get where they're going together. Even if, in those rare cases where they wind up is a dead end, they will have gotten there together.
Yeah. And
they'll both understand, how they got there and why they're there now. But employees shouldn't reject a trial of something out of hand if it's something they'd never considered, they never tried that before, they don't know what that is. It's never a bad idea to try something, but if they're really communicating effectively, usually they're not going to go through too many pointless trials.
Right. Well, and I like that. I like what you said about getting there together, because a lot of this is about transparency and transparency of process and consideration and understanding where either side is coming from. And if you look at it as getting there together rather than a me versus you're much more likely to find a solution that will enable the employee to work effectively and the employer to have a, to have a productive employee. So Nancy, as we anticipated, we have questions. We have questions here. So if an employee and medical provider submit information and assert that an employee cannot return to the office indefinitely, the employee is public facing, and one essential functions is to meet with constituents and government officials in person frequently. Without changing the essential functions of the position, should the employer assign this task to other staff members? I guess temporarily is understood there.
Well, I think that, an employer never has to eliminate essential functions
Right.
from jobs. That's not an accommodation that an employer ever has to provide. It's not an issue of cost or anything like that. The things that are important is that, an essential function is, it's not just something arbitrary that you just say, oh, that's an essential function. I mean, that has to be sort of defensible, if you will, but there certainly are jobs that have essential functions that require some in-person presence somewhere or some in-person interaction. And if that's really the case and the person cannot do it at all, there's no accommodation that can enable them to do it. And again, I don't know what that would be, but if that were the case and no time off is going to solve that, it's not like they're going to get treatment or there's something happening there and it's a short-term situation where maybe they just need some leave, and there's no reassignment suitable that's available for that worker. I mean, a person who is qualified for a job is one who can perform essential functions,
Right.
with or without accommodation. So it does happen sometimes that workers are not qualified for positions, or employees can become unqualified for jobs that they maybe have been doing for a long time, and now something has changed and they are no longer qualified. And if the employer and the employee have gone through the process and they've explored options and interacted in good faith and done all of that, and there just isn't a solution, I mean, that can happen.
Okay, another question that came in. I am wondering, when in the job application process do you disclose the need for an accommodation? In this particular case, it would be remote work, since I am legally blind and do not drive. Do I wait to disclose until I'm offered the job, or do I do it during the interview process? I do worry disclosing the need for a reasonable accommodation before the offer will deter the employer from hiring me, which is a classic concern. And this is a doctoral student considering a research faculty role for background.
Well, I think that, you need to sort of ask for an accommodation when you know you need one, or when you have to, in terms of, I mean, let's say that there's a job that has an essential function that requires in-person attendance. In many cases, I think when employers are doing a good job in their recruitment and their advertisement and their interviewing, they're going to get good candidates, right? They're going to get candidates who are qualified because they've made it clear what the essential functions are, what the working conditions are, what the job duties are, and everything, so that people who aren't qualified aren't going to apply for those jobs. We all have to look for jobs that we're suited for. So in some cases, an employer will say, now, okay, this job requires this, in-person attendance, you got to go to these events, or you got to go to these whatever. Can you do that? And if the answer is no, then maybe that's that's a qualification standard. Now, as an applicant, if you think that an employer is telling you something's an essential function and it isn't, you don't believe that, you can challenge that under the ADA. We've all heard of those old classic examples. Oh, you have to be able to drive or have a driver license to have this job. But you really don't. You might need to go someplace, but you might not need to be able to drive to get there. So the accommodation might be, something, there might be an accommodation there, but maybe there isn't an accommodation. It's just, you're going to do things in a little bit of a different way. But it's really understandable. A lot of people with disabilities don't want to disclose that they have a disability until they get a job offer. And technically, you're not required to disclose your disability per se until or unless really you need an accommodation. There are a few other situations where you would need to disclose before you got a job offer. But again, it really goes back to, what is the job? What are the essential functions? Sometimes a person with a disability might need an accommodation for the application process. And then you're going to, have to disclose and maybe even provide that medical documentation if it's a non-obvious disability or something, to maybe take that pre-employment test or attend the interview or participate in the interview. And the interactive process would be very similar in the pre-offer stage because it's an application process. So I think those are really, really tough and personal situations for individuals with disabilities, particularly, hidden disabilities, as whether you want to disclose, which you can choose to do if and however you want to, but if you don't, you can wait for that job offer, as long as you can do that honestly and you don't tell somebody that you can do essential functions that you really can't do.
Another question here from Joelle. I have run into challenges negotiating what is a reasonable amount of remote work for employees who can complete their job functions remotely most of the time, but also are partially responsible for being available for walk-in / unscheduled visits from people who may need assistance at the office. Is it ever reasonable to reassign that responsibility as an accommodation if there is someone else in the office who could meet that need? Some managers try to uphold that the on-call just in case availability on site is an essential function that shouldn't be reassigned.
Well, that's something employers have to determine.
Right.
I mean, that distinction between essential functions and marginal functions, sometimes that's easy and sometimes it's not so clear. Making the coffee, that's usually marginal, right? Being available for the on-call or whatever, the people coming in the door, that could be essential in some jobs, and in other jobs it might not be essential. It might really be marginal. Now, employers certainly can reassign essential functions or swap essential functions among workers. They don't have to. It's, if they want to, they can. That's a little more like, kind of customizing a job or kind of carving out jobs to work with people's, best skills and talents and everything. But technically, it's only marginal functions that you have to maybe swap or, shift around. Essential functions don't have to be eliminated, but you have to know what they are. That's a starting point. Employers have to figure that out. There's a whole list of factors that the EEOC provides to help us really determine what essential functions are, how much time people spend doing the function, whether it requires a high level of skills, whether it's, a kind of a core function. It's what you hired the person to do and other factors. But no one factor tends to be determinative. I mean, even that factor about how much time a person spends performing a function. Then we have the examples of, the firefighter who rarely has to carry somebody down a flight of stairs or, but when they need to do it, it's pretty essential. So there are always examples that sort of, to exceptions to the rule, so to speak, but you kind of have to look at the factors taken together. And sometimes the number of people available to perform the functions, that's another factor. So if it's, you've got 100 people or 50 people or 1,000 people to do it versus 2, these things can play in. So again, it's really hard sometimes to answer these kinds of questions in the abstract.
Yeah.
We sometimes, that's why we always encourage folks to call us with really specific situations so that we can have more of a conversation and maybe delve into the specifics of the situation and help people come up with those answers in their own situations. What are the essential functions of the job? And, what's reasonable? I mean, what's reasonable is going to be different from one situation to another, right? There's no, this is how many hours you need to be in this location across the board. It just doesn't work that way.
Well, the other thing that I was thinking, and we haven't talked about too much during this particular webinar, is the importance of documentation. I mean, I can't underline that enough. It is so important for both the person with the disability and the employer to document this interactive process, document what they're requesting and what is working and what isn't working, et cetera. Because that is certainly, if a complaint is ever filed, that the documentation is something that is looked at as well. And it's also a great way of showing that you participated in the interactive process, regardless of if you're an employer or a person with a disability. Now, we have another question about commuting. We have seen an increase in requests related to fully remote work accommodation needs related to long commutes exacerbating disability. Can you speak to commutes to the office and decision-making on disability accommodation on the job? It's a great question.
Sure, it is a great question. And it certainly could be a factor. A lot of people have disabilities that would make it difficult or impossible or harmful or painful or something to, engage in a commute. The EEOC has always, since the early days of the ADA, has given us examples of accommodating people who have issues with commuting. Not necessarily about remote work, but remote work could in some cases be the accommodation for that. One of the early examples the EEOC provided is, an individual who uses, because of their disability, they use public transportation. And so their availability, their scheduling, their ability to, meet certain schedules, traditional schedules, is going to be dependent on the public transit system. So they might need an adjusted schedule. And if that's a reasonable thing, if they can come in a half an hour later than everybody else and work a half an hour later, and that works in that job and in that workplace, then maybe that's an accommodation. So even though it's not remote work, it tells us that accommodating that ability to get to and from work is something that might need to be accommodated. So again, remote work might be the answer in a specific situation. If the person can do their job from home and they don't need to be, come into the workplace to do it, then maybe that's the answer.
We have another comment that some employees become adamant that their doctor says WFH, work from home, and are offended that employers consider something besides what the doctor recommends. And I would say that doctors are definitely not familiar with the reasonable accommodation process. So that
Sometimes they're not.
interactive part, I mean, for the most
Yeah.
part, they are not. And, you know, documentation, whole separate topic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, doctors might not, some doctors just think people are going to follow their orders, but,
Right,
again, and they may not be familiar with the ADA and the ADA's process. And sometimes doctors aren't real familiar with their patient's job, what their job really entails and what the workplace is like, and what their duties are. Or sometimes doctors might not be aware of alternatives. They might not know that there might be some assistive technologies or some other strategies or something that might be effective and enable the person either to work in the workplace, or at least work in the workplace sometimes or to some extent. So again, doctors are, Lord love them, they're trying to help their patients, right? And that's fine. And they can provide the medical information about what the person's condition is, how it affects them, all that kind of thing. And sometimes they can give some really valuable information, suggest accommodations, kind of tie the disability to the requested accommodation and explain why the person needs this, specifically. But again, it's not, it doesn't have to just be this one thing. And again, sometimes, like you mentioned earlier, Anne, one party or the other, or both, could sort of get stuck
right.
on what they want or what they don't want, and not be willing to really engage in that process.
Right. So I think that's where keeping an open mind comes in. Now, we have about 5 more minutes, and this is something that I want you to comment on, because we've seen this a lot, and I think it's a quandary for employers on how to address it. But I think invisible disabilities can make it difficult. Since the pandemic, I've seen an increased amount of doctors/therapists writing letters supporting remote work for individuals due to anxiety, including increased anxiety due to fear of COVID exposure. I mean, certainly an issue in this day, post-pandemic, et cetera. So I want to, and I think that's a reality of what we hear a lot of here.
Well, I mean, the ADA's definition encompasses both physical and mental disabilities, and sort of anxiety in and of itself is not necessarily a disability. I found myself saying lately, if you're not a little bit anxious, you're not paying attention.
Really?
To what's going on in the world. But again, if somebody has an anxiety disorder, or a really, a phobia, or things of that nature, those are impairments, and they can be disabilities when they substantially limit major life activities like interacting with others, or any other major life activity, sleeping, or you name it. I mean, those are disabilities. Again, whether remote work is the solution, it may be or might not be. Or it might be, again, a partial, a part of an accommodation, or, a combination. There are lots of things. There are some things that can be done for people who are afraid of exposure or concerned about exposure. And again, some people have very serious other reasons to be concerned about exposure to COVID. They just had transplants and all these things where they're much more vulnerable to COVID, and these kinds of things. And so there are lots of possibilities for something like that. Again, if doctors are saying, my patient has this, and it's a qualified professional, and the information is there that seems like this person meets the definition of disability under the ADA, then you need to really start talking about the practical stuff and seeing what you can do to accommodate.
Yeah, and maybe get some clarification, or what are the limitations imposed by the disability that need to be accommodated? Because sometimes the name of the disability is irrelevant. That
it's not enough.
It isn't. And it's really about, what are the limitations? What are we accommodating here? Because it's one thing to focus, remote work is it, period. And no, let's get away from that and talk about, okay, you're confirming there's a disability here, but what are the limitations here? And let's go through that interactive process before we get to a definitive, this is the only thing that's going to work.
For some people, you might be able to put some protocols in place to enable them to be in the workplace. And for other people, that might not be enough.
Right. Okay, we are moving on to the next slide. Slide 23, please. All right. Well, thank you, Nancy, so much. I love doing webinars about really specific, relevant issues that we're getting a lot of calls and questions about. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you for those of you who gave me lots of positive feedback about the title. I appreciate that. Please, if we didn't answer your question, I know we didn't get to all of them, please give us a call at 1-800-949-4232. And we were happy to talk to you. That's what we do. And we can talk through your specific situation. But thank you for joining us, and you can visit us at adainfo.org for all the information that you need to know about the ADA. But thanks again, Nancy. This was fun, and I hope everybody has a great holiday season.